I knew the HOA was bad news the day I moved in, but nothing could have prepared me for Karen Whitmore. She was the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, ruling with an iron fist and a clipboard. The kind of woman who thought her word was law, even when it wasn't. I'd been living in my house for about 5 years, minding my own business, when I noticed something strange. A brand new fence had appeared overnight on my property, not near the property line, not a few inches over. No, this thing was a solid 3 feet into my yard, cutting off a chunk of land that was very much mine. At first, I thought maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe a contractor got the wrong address. But when I went outside to investigate, there she was, Karen, standing proudly by the fence like she had just built the Great Wall of China. "Oh, good, you're finally seeing it," she said with a sickly sweet smile. "I've been meaning to talk to you about this. You see, the HOA voted and decided that your yard was too big for the neighborhood aesthetic. It made the cul-de-sac look unbalanced. So, to fix the issue, we adjusted the property lines." I blinked. "You adjusted the property lines. You can't just decide that my land is yours." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "It's for the good of the community, don't be selfish. Besides, you don't even use this part of your yard. It makes more sense for it to be part of my property." Now, I'm a patient man. But when someone tries to steal my land and gaslight me into thinking it's for the greater good, that patience runs thin real fast. "I want this fence gone by the end of the week," I said, keeping my voice even, "or I'll take legal action." Karen laughed. "Oh, honey, you don't understand how this works. The HOA has full authority over property disputes in this neighborhood. If you don't like it, you can file a complaint." But I wouldn't hold my breath. Then she turned and strutted back into her house, leaving me standing there staring at my own stolen land. That was the moment I decided. If she wanted a fight, I was going to give her one. And I wasn't just going to take my land back, I was going to take everything. I didn't waste any time. If Karen thought she could take my land with nothing but arrogance and a flimsy excuse, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. First, I pulled out my property deed, along with the official land survey from when I bought the house. Everything was crystal clear. My lot extended exactly where it always had, and the fence she put up was trespassing well into my land. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. This was blatant theft, and I wasn't about to let it slide. Next, I called a local real estate attorney, a sharp guy named Mark who had dealt with more than his fair share of HOA overreach cases. After explaining the situation, he whistled low and told me I had an airtight case. He advised me to document everything: photos, measurements, and any communication with Karen. That night, I walked the perimeter of the new fence with a measuring tape, recording every single detail. I took photos from multiple angles, making sure to include my original property markers in the shots. Then, I went online and pulled up the county's official property records. As I expected, nothing had changed. My lot was still legally mine, meaning Karen had no authority whatsoever to redraw the lines. The next morning, I filed an official complaint with the county zoning office. I also sent Karen a certified letter stating that she had erected an illegal barrier on my property and had 7 days to remove it before I pursued legal action. 2 days later, I got my answer. Karen stood at the edge of the fence, her arms crossed, with 2 other HOA board members flanking her. One was a balding man in his 60s named Richard, the HOA treasurer, and the other was Linda, a woman who seemed to exist solely to nod along with whatever Karen said. Karen's lips curled in amusement as she glanced at the letter in her hand. She waved it like it was a joke. "You really went and got the county involved," she said. "That's cute, but pointless. The HOA has full authority over neighborhood disputes. This is a private community, and our rules supersede city zoning laws." Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "You should be aware that refusing to comply with HOA decisions can result in escalating fines. You wouldn't want to rack up a debt over something so small." Linda nodded like a bobblehead. It's just a fence. No need to get so worked up about it. I tilted my head, studying them. They were so confident, so sure that their little HOA rules could override actual property law. It was almost comical. I pulled out my phone and opened the county property database, showing them the official survey. I pointed to the screen. "This is my land," I said. "And the county disagrees with your little adjustment. You have 5 days to take the fence down, or I'll see you in court. And trust me, once lawyers get involved, this is going to cost you a lot more than a few fines." Karen's confidence faltered for a brief second before she recovered. "You're making a mistake," she said. "The HOA has resources. We can drag this out in legal fees for years if we have to." I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You're welcome to try. But I'll warn you now, if this goes to court, I'm not just going after the fence. I'm going after damages. And if I find any financial misconduct in the HOA's records, I'll make sure the entire board is investigated." For the first time, Richard looked uneasy. His hand twitched at his side, and he glanced at Karen, who was still trying to maintain her composure. "You've been warned," she said, her voice clipped. Then she turned and marched away, with Richard and Linda scurrying after her. I had them rattled. Now, it was just a matter of pushing harder. The next day, I got a response from the zoning office. A county inspector would be coming out to assess the situation. That same afternoon, I filed a request to review the HOA's financial records. As a homeowner, I had the legal right to see how our dues were being spent. 2 days later, the inspector arrived. He walked the property with me, measuring the fence and comparing it to the official records. When he finished, he shook his head. "This is clear-cut trespassing," he said. "I'll file a report, and Karen will be given an official notice to remove the fence. If she refuses, the county will issue fines." I thanked him and watched as he drove off. Now I just had to wait. Later that evening, I got an email from the HOA's accountant. My request for financial records had been approved, and I could come by the office to review them. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA office with Mark, my attorney. The second we started flipping through the budget reports, I knew something was off. There were multiple large withdrawals labeled as community improvements, but there were no corresponding records showing what those funds had been spent on. Even worse, there were several payments made to a company called Whitmore Landscaping, a company that, after a quick online search, I discovered was owned by Karen's nephew. Mark's eyes gleamed. "This is fraud," he whispered. "We've got them." I took copies of everything and left the office feeling like I'd just hit the jackpot. Not only was I going to get my land back, but Karen and her little HOA empire were about to crumble. Now, it was time to make my move. Armed with the financial records, I knew I had the leverage I needed. Karen had already trespassed on my property, but now I had proof that she was misusing HOA funds for personal gain. This wasn't just about the fence anymore, it was about bringing her entire corrupt operation crashing down. I met with my attorney, Mark, later that evening at his office. He laid out the copies of the financial documents across his desk, his expression sharp with focus. The records showed multiple payments to Whitmore Landscaping, Karen's nephew's company, but there were no corresponding invoices or proof of actual work done. Other transactions were labeled as community improvements, yet there was no indication of what those improvements were. Mark tapped his pen on one of the documents. "This is embezzlement. HOA funds are supposed to be used for legitimate expenses that benefit the residents. Pocketing money through a shell company is fraud." I nodded, already forming a plan in my head. "So what's our best move?" He leaned back in his chair, considering. "We hit her from 2 sides. First, we escalate the property dispute. Since the county inspector already confirmed the fence is trespassing, she'll be forced to remove it or face fines. If she refuses, we push for legal action. Second, we take these financial records to the homeowners. If we get enough people on our side, we can call for a vote to remove her from the HOA board. And if she's been using funds illegally, we might even be able to press criminal charges. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. The next morning, I called a meeting with as many homeowners as I could gather. We met in my driveway, a small but determined group of neighbors who had all had their own battles with Karens over each. I laid out the evidence, showing them the financial discrepancies and explaining the situation with my land. The reaction was immediate. People were furious. Many of them had been fined repeatedly for ridiculous reasons: grass an inch too high, the wrong shade of curtains, a mailbox that didn't match the aesthetic. Now they were seeing where their money had really been going. One of the neighbors, a retired police officer named Dan, studied the documents with a practiced eye. "This is bad," he muttered. "If she's been siphoning off HOA funds, she's not just violating HOA bylaws, she's committing fraud. That's a felony." Another homeowner, Maria, crossed her arms. "She fined me $200 last year for leaving my trash cans out an hour late. Meanwhile, she's been helping herself to our dues. We need to take action." That was exactly what I had hoped for. With the community on my side, we had the numbers to make a real change. The next step was filing an official motion to remove Karen from the HOA board. According to the bylaws, we needed a majority vote from homeowners to oust a board member. I spent the next 2 days knocking on doors, talking to frustrated residents, and gathering signatures. Meanwhile, the county followed through on my complaint. Karen received an official notice demanding the fence be removed immediately. Instead of complying, she doubled down. I watched from my driveway as she stormed out of her house, phone in hand, yelling into the receiver. Moments later, a group of men from Whitmore Landscaping arrived not to take the fence down, but to reinforce it. They added cement posts, making it even harder to remove. It was a blatant act of defiance, a challenge. She thought she could outlast me, that I would give up. She was wrong. The next morning, I filed a lawsuit. Mark helped draft the paperwork, citing property theft, trespassing, and damages. Since the fence was preventing me from using my own land, we also included a claim for loss of property value. Then came the real hammer blow. Dan, the retired officer, had a few contacts at the local district attorney's office. He passed along the evidence of financial misconduct, and within 48 hours, an investigation was opened into the HOA's finances. The fallout was immediate. A week later, a state auditor arrived to review the HOA's records. Karen tried to obstruct the investigation, claiming the HOA was a private entity and not subject to external review. That argument didn't last long. The auditor had full authority to inspect financial dealings related to homeowner dues. By the end of the day, they had found enough irregularities to freeze the HOA's accounts pending further investigation. Karen was furious. She showed up at my house that evening, red-faced and seething. She banged on my door, demanding to speak with me, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. Instead, I let her stew, watching through my security cameras as she ranted on my porch before storming off. 2 days later, we held the HOA vote. Over 70% of homeowners turned out more than enough to reach a quorum. The motion to remove Karen from the board passed overwhelmingly. Richard and Linda, her loyal lackeys, resigned on the spot rather than face scrutiny. With Karen stripped of her authority, the final blow came swiftly. The county issued a final warning about the fence, giving her 48 hours to remove it. When she refused, they sent a demolition crew to tear it down, the cost of removal charged directly to her. But the best part, the fraud investigation escalated. The state found enough evidence to file charges. Karen was arrested for embezzlement and ordered to pay restitution. When she couldn't cover the fines and legal fees, her house, her precious kingdom, was seized to satisfy the debt. By the end of it all, not only did I get my land back, but I watched as Karen's entire empire crumbled around her. Justice had been served. With Karen dethroned and her finances in shambles, the neighborhood finally felt like it could breathe again. But there was still work to be done. The HOA, now leaderless, was in complete disarray. Without Karen's iron grip controlling the board, the remaining members scrambled to salvage what was left of their credibility. Many of them had turned a blind eye to her corruption, either out of fear or because they benefited from her favoritism. Now, with an official fraud investigation looming over them, they were eager to distance themselves from her mess. Over the next few weeks, I worked with other homeowners to push for a complete overhaul of the HOA's structure. The first step was electing an entirely new board. Dan, the retired officer who had helped expose Karen's financial misdeeds, was elected as the new president. Maria, who had been one of the loudest voices against the fines and arbitrary rules, took over as treasurer. The rest of the board was filled with people who had suffered under Karen's reign and were determined to bring transparency back to the HOA. One of the first actions the new board took was hiring an independent auditor to go through the HOA's finances. What they found was worse than we had initially thought. Karen's embezzlement ran deeper than we had realized. She had funneled money through multiple fake vendors, not just her nephew's landscaping company. There were payments made to non-existent contractors, inflated expenses for community projects that had never been completed, and even checks written directly to herself under vague descriptions like community outreach. The total amount of stolen funds was staggering. Over the years, Karen had siphoned off tens of thousands of dollars. The HOA's reserve fund, which was supposed to cover emergency repairs and maintenance, was nearly depleted. That explained why so many common areas had fallen into disrepair while Karen's personal property had flourished. With this new evidence, the legal case against her strengthened. The district attorney's office expanded the charges against her, adding multiple counts of fraud and misappropriation of funds. Her legal troubles were only getting worse, and from what I heard, her attorney was struggling to negotiate any kind of deal that would spare her from prison time. But while Karen's downfall was satisfying, the real victory was seeing the neighborhood come together to undo the damage she had caused. The new board immediately repealed many of the ridiculous fines and restrictions she had implemented. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined were reimbursed from what remained of the HOA's funds. The community voted to reduce HOA dues until the reserve fund could be replenished through honest means. One of the biggest priorities was repairing the damage Karen had done to property values. Her constant meddling had driven away potential buyers, and the association's bad reputation had made it difficult for people to sell their homes. To fix that, the board focused on real improvements, actual landscaping work, better maintenance of common areas, and open communication with residents. The difference was noticeable almost immediately. People started spending more time outside, chatting with their neighbors without fear of being reported for some trivial rule violation. The suffocating atmosphere Karen had created was gone, replaced by a sense of cooperation. As for her house, it didn't take long for the bank to foreclose on it. With her assets frozen and the HOA demanding restitution, Karen had no way to keep up with her mortgage payments. Within months, her once pristine home was empty, stripped of its lavish decorations and expensive furniture. The property sat abandoned for a while before being put up for auction. I made sure to attend the auction, if only to see the final nail in her coffin. Watching bidders compete for the house she had once ruled from was a poetic end to her story. In the end, a young couple won the bid, excited to start fresh in a neighborhood that was finally free from her tyranny. With Karen gone, life gradually returned to normal. The HOA, now run by people who actually cared about the community, functioned the way it was supposed to as a support system, not a dictatorship. People no longer lived in fear of random fines or property seizures. The absurd restrictions that had plagued us for years were lifted, replaced by fair and reasonable guidelines that everyone had a say in. Looking back, it was almost unbelievable how much power Karen had wielded over the neighborhood. She had convinced herself that she was untouchable, that her word was law. But in the end, her greed and arrogance were her undoing. No amount of manipulation or intimidation could save her once the truth came to light. And as I stood on my fully restored property, enjoying the space she had once tried to steal from me, I realized something. Justice wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully ours, not just the land, but our sense of community. And that, more than anything, was the true victory. With Karen gone and the HOA under new leadership, things were finally settling down. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for years had lifted, replaced with a sense of relief. People who had once kept their heads down to avoid her wrath were now openly discussing ways to improve the community. It was the kind of neighborhood I had imagined when I first moved in, a place where people looked out for each other instead of living in fear of arbitrary rules. But while Karen's reign had ended, the damage she left behind still needed fixing. The financial recovery was going to take time, and the board had its hands full sorting through the mess she had created. Maria, the new treasurer, was busy renegotiating contracts with legitimate vendors to replace the fake ones Karen had used to funnel money to herself. Dan, as HOA president, was working with residents to revise the bylaws, eliminating the excessive restrictions Karen had imposed. One of the most significant changes was the decision to implement transparency measures. The new board set up a system where all financial transactions were logged and made available for homeowners to review at any time. HOA meetings were now open forums where every resident had a voice, a stark contrast to the closed-door policies Karen had enforced. Despite the progress, there was still an unease lingering over the neighborhood. People were wary, as if they expected another power-hungry figure to rise and take Karen's place. Some residents still hesitated to fully trust the HOA, knowing how easily it had been corrupted before. That hesitation became even more apparent when an unexpected problem arose. Several homeowners reported receiving letters demanding payment for past due HOA fines that had supposedly been erased when the new board took over. At first, it seemed like a clerical error, but after reviewing the records, Maria found something alarming. Karen had set up an external debt collection agency to handle HOA fines, and she had continued to send accounts to them even after she was removed from power. These collections were still active, and homeowners were being harassed for money they no longer owed. Maria and Dan immediately contacted the agency to have the accounts closed, but the response they got was troubling. The collection agency claimed Karen had signed a long-term contract with them, and unless the HOA paid a hefty termination fee, they would continue pursuing the debts. It was a last-ditch effort by Karen to squeeze money out of the neighborhood, even after losing her position. The contract she had signed locked the HOA into a predatory agreement, where the agency took a percentage of all collections and had full authority to pursue fines indefinitely. The board refused to pay the termination fee, knowing it would only set a precedent for more financial abuse. Instead, they contacted the state attorney general's office to report the fraudulent collections. After reviewing the case, the attorney general's office determined that Karen had signed the contract without proper authorization from the HOA, making it legally void. The collection agency was forced to back down, and homeowners who had been receiving threats of legal action were cleared of all bogus debts. It was another victory, but it also served as a reminder that Karen's influence hadn't disappeared overnight. She had spent years embedding herself into the HOA's structure, and untangling her schemes was going to take time. As the months passed, things gradually improved. The neighborhood saw real changes not just in leadership, but in the way people treated each other. Without Karen's toxic influence, neighbors who had once been at odds began working together. The HOA was no longer a weapon used to control residents, but a tool to make the community better. Property values started to recover, and with the negative reputation fading, new families moved in. The house that had once belonged to Karen was now home to a young couple who had no idea of the chaos that had unfolded before they arrived. They were welcomed with open arms, a stark contrast to the hostile environment Karen had fostered. Despite everything, there was still one final piece of unfinished business: Karen herself. Her legal troubles had only worsened since her arrest. The fraud investigation uncovered even more misdeeds, including tax evasion and falsified HOA records. The court found her guilty on multiple counts, and she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The last time I heard anything about her, she was trying to appeal her conviction, claiming she had been unfairly targeted. But no one in the neighborhood had any sympathy left for her. She had spent years abusing her power, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. With her gone, life finally returned to normal. The HOA functioned as it should. Homeowners had control over their community, and the fear that had once ruled the neighborhood was gone. Justice had been served, and for the first time in years, we were truly free. With Karen locked away and her influence purged from the HOA, the neighborhood finally had a chance to heal. The new board worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, ensuring that every homeowner had a voice in decisions that affected them. Without the suffocating grip of arbitrary fines and power plays, people began to treat their homes as actual homes, not as properties under constant scrutiny. One of the most significant changes was the way people interacted. Before, neighbors had kept to themselves, afraid that a casual conversation might lead to a complaint or citation. Now, people were out in their yards, chatting over fences, organizing block events, even helping each other with repairs and yard work. It was a complete turnaround from the paranoia that had once dominated the community. The property that Karen had tried to steal from me was fully restored. I wasted no time reclaiming every inch of my land, tearing out the remnants of the illegal fence. After a long battle, standing on my rightful property felt like a personal victory. I decided to make the most of it, planting a vegetable garden and setting up a small patio area. Every time I sat there with my morning coffee, I was reminded of how close I had come to losing it and how important it was to stand up for what was right. But even with Karen out of the picture, there were still lingering complications. The legal fallout from her fraudulent activities had left the HOA in financial strain. While the worst of the damage had been addressed, there were still unresolved lawsuits from homeowners who had been wrongly fined or forced into costly repairs under her rule. The board had to carefully navigate these claims while ensuring the remaining HOA funds were managed responsibly. Dan, as the new president, handled the situation with a steady hand. He worked with homeowners to settle disputes fairly, often negotiating reasonable solutions that didn't drain the HOA's resources. Maria, as treasurer, monitored every expenditure with vigilance, ensuring that not a single dollar was misused. Over time, their efforts paid off, and the community slowly climbed out of the hole Karen had left behind. The biggest remaining question was what would happen to Karen's former allies. While some board members had willingly resigned, a few of her supporters remained in the neighborhood, bitter but powerless. They no longer had the authority to impose ridiculous rules or manipulate the system to their advantage. Some tried to rally against the new board, but without Karen's aggressive tactics backing them, they quickly lost influence. One particular holdout was Richard, the former treasurer who had turned a blind eye to Karen's financial manipulations. He had managed to avoid legal consequences by claiming ignorance, but his reputation was permanently damaged. No one trusted him anymore, and he found himself isolated. Unable to wield power over others, he sold his house and left the neighborhood within a few months. As the months passed, the changes solidified. Home values stabilized, the HOA operated with transparency, and the fear of unjust fines became a distant memory. The neighborhood had transformed into what it was always meant to be: a community, not a battleground. The final chapter of Karen's downfall came when news of her sentencing reached us. The court had denied her appeal, and she was officially serving a substantial prison sentence. There was no chance of her ever returning to reclaim her lost power. One evening, I stood outside as the sun set, looking around at the peaceful street. Kids played on the sidewalks, neighbors exchanged friendly waves, and the oppressive atmosphere that had once loomed over us was completely gone. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood had emerged stronger than ever.